Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second part of lecture 19. I'm going to pick up from where we last ended yesterday, and that was the data structures diagram in our in our design. So, having done the data structure, as you can see, we've got the subject rec and the student record structure in place. The next thing we will have to do is we will have to do the variables. So let's list the variables in our design. Okay, and remember the way we do our variables is we list only our global variables. So in this case, it would be a students array, all right, and it would be of type student rec. So we can mention that it is of type student rec, and it is an array. So maybe we can indicate that this will be an array, and you can actually do it as a table if you want, but for the purpose of a semester test, please note that you don't have to go into that much detail for the second semester test and the exam. Remember, you've got 20 minutes. The main thing we want to get from you is that you do your design in such a way that it actually helps you. So please try not to go overboard with your design, but also don't do it in such a way that we can see you didn't put in any effort at all. All right, so you've got your students record structure, array of record structure, but you will also need a integer variable for the number of students. So maybe I would put in n students, and I would have n subjects, and we will also have n terms, because these will all be used to indicate the number of, well, the dimensions of our record structure. Okay, so these are all integer, and at this point in time, I think these are the only things I need for this particular problem. Please note that your design is going to change or vary from one question paper to the other, and this is just a reminder for everyone who does the tutorial on Friday. Please note that tutorial 8 is up on Eve. We really recommend that you start working on it on your own, so that when we go through the tutorial tomorrow, we don't have to waste any time waiting and saying, okay, we're going to give you 5 minutes to work on so and so. Rather have your answers all on hand, and then we can then go through the how we would have gone through it, and then the best thing is for you to compare how we've done it compared to how you've done it, and you can always raise questions as to whether, if you've done it differently, does that make sense? Are you still on the right track? Because remember, our solution is not the solution. It is one possible solution, and you might have done it differently and it will still actually work. And please remember, the idea is not for you to emulate, copy us exactly as closely as possible. It is you finding out your own way of solving this same problem, but in a way that is correct in terms of programming principle. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you need to ask a question at any point in time during this lecture, please raise your hand, and then we will give you access to speak up. All right, so having done the variables, and let's just go through this. We did the input, we did the output, we did the actions and events, we did the data structures, we did the variables. Technically, we should also do the, okay, I see we've got someone with a query, so let's just make you a presenter. Yes, can you unmute your mic and speak up?
Prof. Leung.
Yes, hi.
Can you leave the purposes under variables, or must we put them?
No, you don't have to put the purposes. So for your weekly practicals, I would recommend doing so, because you are going to explain to your assistant why you think a certain variable is in place. But for the purpose of the semester test or in the exam, I don't think it's necessary. But if you are one of those who are not 100% sure why you need to have a variable, then I would put it down so that it's really to help you. Remember, you're trying to say, well, do I need this variable or not? Because if I know for sure that I definitely need this variable, then it's fine. But if you're like,
Okay.
I don't really know, then write it down so you can actually show, you can write down for yourself and read to yourself, well, does this make sense? Because if it doesn't make
Okay.
sense that this variable is here, then why are you putting it down? Okay. All right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's move on. So with regards to the variables, okay, we've done the variables, and technically we should do test data now at this point, and so we can do test data here. However, I am going to leave the test data for Mr. Labia to go through with you in the tutorial starting from tomorrow, because what we would like you to do is actually do your test data properly. We have picked up that a lot of you are just throwing some random values in as test data, and there's actually a better strategy for coming up with test data that will test your program properly. We find that sometimes people write programs and they get all the way to the end of the program and everything seems fine, and apparently they tested it, but then when we test it using the test data that we've now set up, we find out that we crash your program, and then you're all very surprised. So Mr. Labia will go through how to come up with proper test data so that if in a semester test and you want to test your program extensively, you then use this kind of test data generation strategy, then this will help you ensure that your test data is testing your program as robustly as possible. What we mean by that is we're testing it for all possible scenarios, so that if there is a possibility that your program is incorrectly written and it will crash, your test data, the right kind of test data will pick that up. But if you are using the wrong kind of test data, if we can put it that way, the easy kind of test data, you'll find that it actually tests your program, but in a very soft way, like, oh, gently touching your program just to go, I hope you don't fall over. The idea is test data should really be brutal and go, we're going to throw everything at your program, we're going to try crash your program, and if your program doesn't crash, wonderful. That's the aim of test data, really. Not for you to just go, well, I feel, I'm patting myself on the back, I put some values together, and when I put these values together into my program didn't crash. Yay. The idea is to really test your program. Okay, but having said that, I will mention this again. When it comes to test data, please make sure that your dimensions here, so your N student, N subjects, N terms, when you're working with dimensions like this, always make sure that these dimensions are different values. So an example, and this is not the full test data, but I would say that I would ensure that N students perhaps might be 2, so the dimension for N students is 2. N subjects, I will not use 2, I would use something like 3, it would be a different value. And then N terms, I will either try, I can use 2 again maybe, but I will not use, it will not be, so bad values would be like 2, 2, 2, because if you use 2, 2, 2, then this will cause an issue. All right. Yes, we have another query. Yes, please ask your question. Yes, can you speak up? We're just hearing a lot of noise. We're not hearing you.
I wanted to ask if when we are writing our test data, we write for each subject, for the subject each term, or we just write the totals, or I don't know. I just want the easy way. I want you to help me understand how to do it, because I'm not sure if we have to write everything for each subject. We have to write for all terms, or that's what
yes, you will
trying
have
to get
to. Yeah, the idea of test data is that you need to write test data that represents all the inputs that a user will provide. So remember, test data is you specifying, so for this example here I'm specifying just the dimensions, okay? But in addition to the dimensions, this means that I would have to put test data where I provide the details for 2 students, because I've got 2 students, but for each of those 2 students, I need to have the details of the 3 subjects for each of those students, and for each of those subjects, I need to have 2 marks for each of those subjects for each of those students. All right. Okay, so as I said, Mr. Labia will go through this with you on Friday. So please do attend the tutorial. Now, for those of you who are attending the Thursday and Tuesday tutorials, don't worry, we'll get to you next week. This is the cycle that we're trying to go with, so that the Friday people get it earlier, so that they are better prepared to answer the practicals that come up as we go along. All right, and so with regards to the test data, I'm going to leave that out, but remember this test data should be a lot more extensive than what I have written here. So I'm going to write that more data needed. Okay, this is not complete. All right. So having done the test data, well, sort of done the test data as well as the variables and the data structure and so on, the next thing we need to do is the interface. And please, ladies and gentlemen, I know that doing the interface can be a bit of a schlep, because there's a lot of buttons that you have to label if you are going to go with a multi-button approach. But what is very important here is that you actually draw your UJ grid in detail for me. So whatever this UJ grid is called, so in my example, I've decided I'm going to call it grid S, okay, because it is the student subject grid. And depending on your question, you might be told that your rows must be a certain something and your columns must be a certain something. So in this example, chances are we are going to display, well, we're going to display our students, and for each of our students, we're going to display our subjects. Now, having said that, you can now tell that it is not possible in this particular UJ grid to display the marks for each term, for the reason that if you were to use students as your rows and your subjects as your grid, and I typically do this because I would take the outermost record structure, which is my students, and I'll use them as my rows, so that it will make my life easier when I write my subroutine for displaying to the grid. So I would probably do something like this, where I go student 1, student 2, okay, and then I go dot, 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 and then my last row would be student NS. But now it is in students, so I'm going to have to put in student there, so that I know that this is how many rows I've got so far. Then for my columns, I know that it would be subject 1 and subject 2. So please note the detail I'm providing here. Dot, dot, dot. And then I'll have a subject. And then the last one is in subjects. And so you can see that in this particular problem, please just draw your UJ grid a little bit more neater than mine. Maybe I must actually redraw the UJ grid. But the idea is then you would have your students, and then that's a text box there. Then how many subjects there are, that's a text box there. And how many terms there are, and there's a text box there. And then maybe a button here that says initialize. Okay, and then you have all your other buttons that follow afterwards, and then you put your captions there. And please remember to label everything. Okay, so if you label everything, when you do this, please make sure that your labels match what you've said here. So if you now call the button BTN init, please make sure that this is called BTN init. Please don't decide, well, I called it BTN init over here. However, I am just going to go change this to some other name because I've forgotten my design already. So having said that, I would suggest to you that you should try and draw your UJ grid in such a way that it's detailed enough for you to tell exactly from a glance, from this design, how many rows and how many columns you require for this particular UJ grid. Now, if we actually go through our question, so let's look at our question here. You'll see that what do we actually need to calculate? And we've actually written it in our design here. Okay, the output was that we need to have an average grade 12 mark, which is a subject per student. Now where is that displayed in UJ grid? So you've got to think of this. And the name of the best subject per student, where do we display this? And the average grade 12 mark per student, where is this displayed? And then the rating per student, where is this displayed? So going back to our design here, if we were to redraw this UJ grid, we could see that this is what's going to happen. So you've got student 1, student 2, okay, dot, and then actually the last row is student in student, okay? Then you get subject 1, subject 2, dot, all right? However, going back here, you can see that we need the average grade 12 mark per student, per subject per student. Question 3, I'm going to highlight this here, okay? This is going to be, so the average mark per student, per subject, where does that go? All right, and let's use yellow. The name of the best subject, where does this go in our UJ grid? And then the average grade 12 mark per student, as well as the rating per student. I'm just going to highlight these in color so that when we go here, we can see that the first one, which is the average per subject per student, actually gets displayed in this area. All right, and where this last column here is subject and it is in subject. So this is the last subject in that particular column. Right, after that last in subject column, you will then have, let's go back here, the name of the best subject per student. So that means for student 1, what is the name of student 1's best subject? So here we would say best subject, okay? I would write it a little, I should write it a little bit clearer. So the best subject will go into this column, and that is followed by the average grade 12 mark per student. All right, so this would be the average mark per student. So that's why you put that there as well. And then this last one is the rating per student. So we would put that over in the last column there. And so when we do our highlighting, you can see that this one is for that. The rating goes into that space. The average mark goes into that space. And the best subject goes into that space. So you can see that I've planned out where exactly in my grid everything goes. Now, the other important thing that we're picking up here is basically how many rows do we have here? And that is in student plus 1, because this is the label. So this is the plus 1. Whereas in terms of how many columns altogether, it would be in subject plus, and then here you will see that it's plus 1 for the label, but it's plus a second one for the best subject, a third one for the best, for the average mark, and fourth one for the rating. Yes, please ask your, let's ask your question. Yes, please unmute your mic. Thank you.
Prof.
Yes.
Prof,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm about
Sorry, you're breaking
where do
up.
we include
Sorry, you're breaking up.
the
We
terms,
can't hear.
the marks per
So,
terms?
where do
Yeah.
we put in the
I'm
marks per term?
asking where do you them where there's like term 1, 2, term 3.
Okay, we can't hear most of what you're saying, but I'm assuming you're asking
can
where
you,
do we. No, you're breaking up. We hear only every bit. Mr. Labia, are you hearing Mr. Mashlangu's question, or is he breaking up as well for you?
No, it's just the same this side as well. I hear bits and pieces of the question.
Okay, we're assuming that your question actually is where do you display the marks for the marks per term, per subject, per student? Now, if that is the question, you don't display it because, ladies and gentlemen, if you go back to your question here, so let's just put this out. If you look at the question here, it says the user must be able to input the necessary information for each student, and that includes the information of the marks per term, of the marks of each term per subject per student. That's all it said, input the information. But the very next question says, for each grade 12 subject of each student, calculate, store, and display the subject average. So we never asked you to display the marks for each term, for each subject, for each student. And at any rate, the marks per term, per subject, per student is actually three-dimensional. And therefore, you cannot actually display three-dimensional data in this two-dimensional space. So don't think that you have to display everything that you input. In fact, you cannot display. The minute you see that there's data in a third dimension, and we know it's a third dimension because if you look at our record structure here, you will see that there is an array, dimension 1, inside an array, so dimension 2, inside a third array, meaning that that marks is three-dimensional. You cannot display marks. You can display the subject's average, okay, because that's not three-dimensional. That is one field in a two-dimensional array. That's why our question actually says display only the average. So this display is basically what we need to display. All right. Okay. I hope that has answered your question. Yes.
Prof,
Yeah.
so what about the number of terms, like the term 1, term 2? Where will we like display the?
But why would you need to display the number of terms? Because to remember, terms is basically the marks for each term. So that is a third dimensional data.
So actually, like, what are we inputting for subject 1, student 1 for an example?
You need to put in, so if you think about your grade 12 report card, you think about when you input, I'm going to ask you, okay, student 1, you're student 1, okay. You're student 1?
Yes.
All right, what is your name? What is your student number? What is surname, initials, etc. Right. Okay, so I've asked you information for your student information. So let me quickly go up here. So we have asked you for your student number, your surname, your initials. Then you've got two subjects. Okay, let's make it two subjects. So I say for subject 1, what is the name of your subject?
Okay, English.
Okay, English, right. So now I'm in the marks array. So I'm going to ask you, how much did you get for English in term 1? Now you can make your figure up. So you got 100. Wow. Okay, fantastic. So let's say you've got 3 terms. So I say in term 2, what did you get for English? And you give me another mark, right? Then I say in term
Yes.
3, what did you get for English? And you give me another mark. Then I stop and I move to the next subject. I say, all right, for subject 2, what is the name of your second subject?
Oh,
And then
okay.
you,
Yeah, mathematics.
yeah, okay, mathematics. Then I go, right, for mathematics, term 1, what did you get? For term 2, what did you get? For term 3, what did you get? All right, and then I leave it because I've done all your subjects. And then I move on to the next student. And then maybe the next student is somebody else. And then I ask, okay, student 2, what is your student number? What is your surname? What is your initials? Right, for your subject 1,
Oh.
what is the name of your subject 1? Okay, what is your mark for subject 1 for term 1? What is your mark for term 2? Term 3. Then I go subject 2, what is the name? Mark 1, mark 2, mark 3, and I go on like that. Okay.
Oh, okay. I understand. Okay.
But
Okay.
when we ask you this information, it doesn't mean that you are forced to display everything that you have had to
Okay.
ask the user. Okay, all right. So we're all good there. I hope I've answered everybody's question now. Okay, all right. So let's continue moving on. So the reason why I've actually focused on this UJ grid is mainly because we want to see how we display the UJ grid. Okay, this is quite important, and also to specify exactly how many rows and columns we are going to have in our UJ grid. For the reason that when we start programming, we don't have to then we can actually see right from the get-go here, oh, when we once we know how many rows and columns, well, how many subjects, students, and terms there are, we can redim our array for everything, and then we can also resize our grid as necessary. Now, we're going to move on to the last part, which is the algorithm. All right, and remember, technically, in a normal practical, you're going to have to list all your algorithms. So you must get into the practice of writing out all your algorithms. However, for a second semester test and an exam, we are willing to say, all right, as long as you show us one algorithm, we are fine with that. But when it comes to this algorithm, please then do the algorithm for question 1 or 2. Don't give us the ones where you just go, oh, I'm going to use a text box, or I'm going to use an input box, and I'm going to ask the user how many, and then I'm just going to set the size of the array. We don't want that, because that's not an actual calculation. We want you to demonstrate that you understand what an algorithm is by giving us an actual algorithm. So the one that I want to actually go through with you is going to be the, okay, we're going to go through this one here, question 5, which is, for each student, calculate, store, and display the name of the grade 12 subject that scored the highest mark. Okay, because here we want to know, for every single student, we would like to know what is the name of their best subject. Now, in order for us to find out the name of the best subject, we actually need to compare not the best subject name, but rather the average. Okay, this is, so we want to know which student had, for every single student, if we look at all their subjects, we want to look based on this average, what is the name. So, in other words, we are not interested in knowing what is the maximum value. Rather, we're interested in knowing where is the maximum value, because once we know the maximum value, we would then be able to figure out what the name of the subject is. So, our algorithm is going to be as follows. Now, hopefully you all are pretty much more or less, okay, there's a J. Oliver. Okay, please ask you, well, let's just make you, okay, yes, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Can we use the dot max function?
No, you cannot use the dot max function because the point of this exercise is problem solving. So we want to see that you're able to write your own max function. Okay, but you can use your max function when you get to third year. Then you don't want to show off that you know how to write your own max function on your own. Okay. Okay, but that is a very good question. Thank you for asking that. For ladies and gentlemen, please do not use the max function in your solution. If you do that, you are going to lose all the marks for that particular question. All right, so let's move on. So let's actually write out the algorithm for our finding the maximum. And so hopefully you actually remember what the algorithm more or less looks like. So I'm going to start off with the basic algorithm, which is, because I said we technically want to know where it is, I'm going to have a maximum, okay, and maximum is going to be, and the idea is we're comparing the mark, the highest average of a student. So we're going to say students, and remember now students is an array, and here I'm going to put in S there, dot, and then I'm going to have subjects 1. Please note it is subjects 1 dot average. Okay, and do try to make sure that, okay, so it was AVER, so I should actually use the same as my code. All right, so let's see, subjects, this was the name of my subject, students. Okay, so max is students s dot subjects 1 dot average, and the reason for that is, remember, we need to do this for each and every single student, and that is why we're going to have s there. No, erase it. We have to have s there, and we have 1 there, because remember, for each student we're going to start off with the first element of the array, which is element 1 of subjects, and then we're going to have a for loop. Okay, there's another question there. Yes, let's try and make, okay, yes, please ask your question. Please unmute your mic.
I wanted to ask, isn't this one supposed to be in a for loop since we have S there?
Yeah, it is supposed to be a for loop, but what I'm doing is I'm starting with the basic part of the algorithm. So just let me finish the basic part of the algorithm. You can see I've got the space. I've left the space out here for a reason. Okay. All right. Okay. So what I've got here is, I am just, remember, a normal algorithm, the standard finding a maximum algorithm was basically this. First is max. You remember this, and then you go through rest of array, and then you should have an if statement, if comparison, and if this is true, update. So this is, in a nutshell, the algorithm, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to apply this algorithm to our particular situation, which is their max must be the first element. That's what I'm doing. The first is the max. All right. So next thing I have to do is go through the rest of the array. So we go for SU, okay, is 2 to n subjects. All right, please note I'm using 2 because I've already looked at the first element there, and I say if max is less than students s dot subjects su dot aver, then what will happen is, if this is true, we need to say max technically should update itself to the students. Okay, can you just let me finish this algorithm here, and then we'll get to you. All right, so we've got our students s dot subjects su dot average, right? And if this is the case, the other thing I would want to do is, technically I'm going to say, well, if this is the current max, what must we actually do? We actually need to update the name of our subject. Okay, so over here we will put in students s dot subject, students s dot, let's quickly see, best subject. Okay, so we say students dot best subject is equal to, and you need to now say, well, if this is the current max, it is actually students S dot subjects SU, because we are in the current SU, dot name. Right. So update the best subject's name to the current name, the name of the current subject that we are at. All right. And so instead of using an index here, we would update the name of the subject instead. All right, so we can have an if, but remember this is just an algorithm, so this is my if statement, and then we end this off here. Now this means if we want to do it for every single student, we would need to have a for loop, which is a for s, which takes on 1 to n students, so that s can be used there, there, and there. All right, because remember S needs to come from somewhere, and that's why there needs to be a for S loop. Now, having said that, remember that an algorithm, if you're going to update a maximum, you also need to update the name, because if you write this code exactly as is here, what will happen is that if the maximum is indeed the first subject, you will not get a subject name because it was never initialized in the first place. So over here, I will also need to say students S dot best subject is actually students S dot subjects 1 dot name. All right, so that is effectively my algorithm that I'm going to write down just to satisfy the requirement that we have to do an algorithm. Please don't write this algorithm here. Okay, this is an algorithm for finding a maximum, but it has no application. It doesn't help you in terms of answering the question specifically for this particular problem. So your algorithm needs to be more along the lines of this. And, well, try to be a little bit more neat than me, but that's the idea. Okay, so we are now going to ask you, RJ Zeta, let's make you a presenter. Okay, so you can ask your question.
I said what I wanted to say. I just forgot to lower my hand.
Oh, okay, all right. Thank you. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, I know so what you should pick up from here, this particular algorithm, is that it is the same question. I'll get to you now, Jay Oliver. The point of this question is that it is the same problem over and over again. The only thing that's happening is that we've changed the story, or we've changed it slightly, so that instead of wanting to know exactly where this maximum is, we are taking advantage of the fact that the minute we know that there is a new maximum, we are going to update our name of the subject immediately. Okay, you can actually solve this differently in the sense that instead of doing what I've done, okay, so in other words, over here, I basically updated the subject name, and I updated the subject name. What you can also do is, instead of updating the subject name, you could do it the same way you've been doing it the whole time, which is finding the location. So instead, you could have alternatively over here and over here, updated it in such a way that you said it is the max index is 1, all right, over here. And then over here, you could have then said that your max index is equal to SU, okay? So instead of what I've done here, you could have done that, but then what it means is that over here, after your for loop, in this location, you would then need to say students S. So this is students S dot best subject is then students S dot subjects max index dot name. All right. Okay. There's a question. Do you not have the question anymore? All right. So please note there are options that you can do, and that's why we, Mr. Levier has always said, please don't copy us. Take the, you might have a different way of doing this question, and I've already shown you now. Just sitting here displaying this to you. I've shown you for me, what comes naturally is this approach, but that is not to say that this approach is any better than this alternative that I've provided here. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you are not sure whether you're on the right track or not, please give it a try and do it, and then during the tutorials or during the lectures, come to us and ask us and say, listen, this is how I've done my question. Am I on the right track? Because, when you do so, other students might actually also benefit from your point of view, because they might see, oh, you know what, I actually would have wanted to do it that way too, but I just didn't. Okay, so at this point in time, I would like to open this up to ask you, please present all your questions to us, because I think given the time, I would rather like to start on the actual implementation in VB in my next lecture instead. So please just ask away any questions that you might have. Okay, right, yes, thank you. Let's ask. Okay, Jay Oliver first. Let's ask your question. Yes.
What is the point of the first loop?
The first loop, you mean the S loop?
Yeah.
Okay, the S loop is to ensure, remember, we are asking you to calculate the best subject for each and every student. So if we look at this code here as is, if we look at from max here to down here, this is your standard finding a maximum in an array algorithm, right? But because we have to find multiple best subjects for students, we need the top for loop so that we're able to do it for each and every single student. And that's why we need to incorporate a for loop up here to repeat the finding a maximum for so many student times. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so the next person. Right, yes. Okay. Right, please ask your question. Yeah.
It seems like you're only comparing the averages, because I see the if statement, if max is less than students, one subject, one dot average, then, or I don't understand the if statement.
You don't understand the if statement over here?
Yes.
Right. Okay, so let's take this into the context. Do you understand what we're trying to find out, right? So let's take you. Let's just look at you as a student. We want to know what is the name of your best subject, okay? Now remember, you've got two subjects. You've got two subjects. One of them is best, obviously. You might say, well, no, both my subjects are the same marks. In informatics one, we assume always that the values are different. Okay, so one of your subjects is better than the other one. So what we're doing here is, how do we know which of your subjects is the best? What will we have to look at to verify that is the best subject?
The average.
Yes, the average. So what's happening here is the max says, okay, we're currently looking at you, student one. You are student one. We're going to start off by saying your first subject's average. That is the maximum.
Okay.
All right. Then
Okay.
in the if
Yes.
statement, we now say, well, we've got an idea of what a maximum should be. We're going to compare this maximum with the rest of your subjects. So the for loop then says, well, then let's look at the rest of your subjects. And so your question specifically is this if statement here. So we say, right, we know what the maximum is. At the moment, the maximum is the average of your first subject. We're going to
Subject.
compare
Yes.
the average. We're going to compare the average of the first subject, which is currently in max, with the average of your other subjects. Remember, the SU
Yes.
here ensures that we look at all the other subjects that you have. And so
Yes.
if it is true that the maximum is smaller than your second subject's average, what happens then is we need to update that maximum to this
Yes.
new average. So if your second subject happens to be a higher mark than your first subject, we need to now update our max. So let's say your second subject mark is 75 and it is higher than the first subject, then your maximum must now be 75. All right.
Yes.
And once it is bigger than 75, we then say if there was a third subject or a fourth subject, we will then continue with the for loop and we will keep comparing this maximum that we now come across or will keep updating with the rest of the averages in your array. So what you do need to realize, and everyone else should realize, is that the average here, see subjects S dot subjects 1, students S dot subjects 1 dot add. That line here should actually be exactly the same as the if statement here. The only difference is over here we use a 1, but down here we must start using the SU, which is part of the for loop. All right, does that answer your question?
Yes, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, do we have any other questions? Because if we don't have any other questions, as I said, I would prefer to start on the Visual Studio. Yes, so please ask your question. Omar, let's make you a presenter. All right, so, okay, Mr. Lebia and I are working against each other. All right, yes, please ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes,
Okay, if you could just move to the interface.
Interface, okay, yes.
So basically for your subjects, right, are you going to be displaying the string name of each subject that the student enters in the columns
No.
going across?
Yeah, no, we can't because, okay, we're actually out of time now, but I'm just going to answer your question and we're going to leave it at that. We can't because remember, you're student 1, someone else is student 2, you might have different subject names compared to someone else. So if you keep displaying the subject names at the top row, you're going to overwrite each other's subject name. So no, please, subject 1, subject 2, keep it as subject 1, subject 2. In fact, I never advocate for you to even display the student names here or the subject names there. All right. Okay. Yes.
I mean, inside of the actual column, right? So for student 1 going across, so under subject 1 for student 1, are you going to be displaying his subject name or are you going to be displaying his actual mark for that subject?
The actual mark. We do not display subject names.
Okay, so if you're going to be displaying the actual mark, so will it be the average for the amount of terms of that mark?
No, the mark that we're displaying here. So let's go here. If we're displaying marks here, it is the average of all your of the subject 1. So we're not displaying the mark for term per subject per student. That is not possible because that will be 3-dimensional.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, as we, Mr. Lebia keeps trying to tell me, we're going to be disconnected. So that is the end of today's lecture. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's lecture. Tomorrow, this afternoon, we have the tutorial. Tomorrow, we've got the tutorial. Next week, Monday, we will continue with this problem, and we're going to implement it in Visual Basic. So for those of you who want to do better and prepare, I would suggest that you try and implement this on your own so you can compare what I've done with what you have done. And feel free to ask questions as we go. All right. Thank you very much. Goodbye, ladies and gentlemen. We will upload this as soon as we're able to.